Thank you, everyone, and welcome to UNIDIR Middle East Weapon of Mass Destruction Free Zone Project launch event on the essays Means of Delivery, Complex and Evolving Issue in the Middle East Weapon of Mass Destruction Free Zone initiative. The report is now available online as well, and a link will be posted in the chat. To those of you that are not familiar with our project, it was launched in October 2019 with support and funding from the European Union. The project aimed to fill research gap on the evolution of the Middle East Weapon of Mass Destruction Free Zone, build capacity, develop new ideas, and foster regional dialogue. Negotiating on a Middle East free of weapon of mass destruction in the Middle East is a complicated matter, both politically and technically. And in previous events and publication, we examined nuclear, chemical, and biological aspects related to the negotiation and implementation of the zone. Nasser paper today allow us the opportunity to discuss one additional aspect, means of delivery. Given the dual use nature and the intersection with conventional weapon, the title of Nasser paper characterizing the issue as evolving and complex is very fitting. And I'm thankful for Nasser for writing this paper and give us the opportunity to discuss this important issue. Before I introduce Nasser, a few housekeeping items. Please note that the event is on record and recorded. The default of all your videos and mics is off, but if you want to ask a question, please do it in the Q&A option in the bottom of your screen, of your Zoom screen. And you will have the opportunity to turn your mic and camera on when you are called to ask a question. We hope to accommodate as many questions as possible. And Letitia, our event coordinator, also put in the chat box her contact information in case you have any technical difficulty. With that, it's my true pleasure to introduce our speaker today, El Sharif Nasser Bin Nasser. He is the founder of MBIT Advisory, a non-governmental organization focused on security and development issues in the Middle East, and the founder of InfoSynth, a geopolitical strategic advisory firm. Previously, Nasser headed the Middle East Scientific Institute for Security, MISIS, where he worked to address chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear risk across the Middle East. Nasser also headed the Middle East Regional Secretariat under the European Union Chemical, Biological, Radiological, and Nuclear Risk Mitigation Center of Excellence Initiative. Prior to that, Nasser worked in the office of His Majesty King Abdullah II of Jordan, where he last served as a senior analyst in the Foreign Affairs Directorate. He received his master's degree in Near East Studies from Princeton University. With that, Nasser, the mic is yours to present the paper.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone from wherever you may be joining. It's a pleasure and honor to be here today on the occasion of the publication of my paper. And I have a lot of people to thank for their help in getting the paper towards publication, including many of the people at UNIDIR, but also numerous and countless experts who weighed in on the paper as it was being developed. I have a brief introduction, if you bear with me as I bring up my slides. I'd like to start just by maybe giving some context or some background, or maybe some disclaimers actually, regarding the paper's objectives of what it is and what it isn't addressing. To begin with, I have to clarify that we are not prescribing a specific or magic solution to the region's problems, which are complex as they are pressing, but rather we are, I would say, trying to present options for states to consider. We're not being unrealistic. We recognize how complicated the situation is on the ground. We're trying maybe to envision a time or a situation when there is agreement on controls of means of delivery, whenever that may be in the future. And we're trying to prepare for such a time so that we can support governments and policymakers with some creative thinking about what that could look like. We're also definitely being as apolitical as possible. We're not assigning blame to any parties or finger pointing. We want to just focus on the technical aspects of this. And we're also would be very appreciative of any feedback on the identified options that have been presented in my paper. So means of delivery, what does means of delivery refer to as it is in my paper? It's certain classes of missiles that are capable of delivery of WMD payloads. This includes land, air, or sea-launched ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, loitering munitions, drones, as well as aircraft and artillery with characteristics that make them either exclusively WMD use or dual use. Means of delivery have traditionally been bundled together with ballistic missiles and cruise missiles as well, for the following reasons. It was considered to be the primary or most effective method to deliver WMD, or the only plausible mission for them in the past. The region has witnessed the most extensive use of ballistic missiles anywhere since World War II, and a total of 11 states in the region continue to possess them. We don't mean to disregard cruise missiles here at all, but because they aren't as widespread and because they haven't been as used in regional conflict, the focus of the paper has tended to gravitate towards ballistic missiles, but that's certainly not the case. So ballistic missiles are no longer bundled together with WMDs as they were in the past, primarily for two reasons. One, the growing utility of ballistic missiles for conventional use, i.e. non-WMD use, due to guidance and accuracy improvements. And two, the growing ability of other platforms to carry WMD payloads, including but not limited to unmanned drones, cruise missiles, underwater drones, to name a few. In terms of the regional historical context, or the historical context rather, not the regional one, the first mention of means of delivery internationally came in 1991 in Resolution 867, which noted the goal of a zone free of weapons of mass destruction and all missiles for their delivery. In the same year, the Bush Initiative proposed a freeze on the acquisition, production, and testing of surface-to-surface ballistic missiles. Bush here singled out means of delivery as being surface-to-surface ballistic missiles only. The first regional mention of WMD came in the Review and Extension Conference of the NPT in 1995, where a resolution was adopted calling for the establishment of an effectively verifiable Middle East zone free of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, and biological, and their delivery systems. This was the first mention of WMD and delivery and means of delivery systems in international resolutions in the context of the zone, but it didn't define what was meant by delivery systems, which has obviously created repercussions until this day. In 2004, Resolution 1540 required all states to adopt and enforce appropriate, effective laws which prohibit any non-state actor to manufacture, acquire, possess, develop, transport, transfer, or use nuclear, chemical, biological weapons and their means of delivery. And it was the first instance that really elaborated and defined what means of delivery meant. Finally, the 2018, 2019, the Conference on the Establishment of a Middle East Zone free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. They held their first and second sessions, while the UNGA resolution that adopted the conference process makes reference to the 95 NPT REVCON resolution. Neither its reports or decisions of the two sessions made any explicit mention of means of delivery. In terms of the regional context, the regional driven efforts, there have been a few as well. The Mubarak Initiative in 1990 proposed the elimination of WMD, and subsequently in 1991 included additional proposals that called on Middle East states to declare their commitment actively and fairly to address measures relating to all forms of delivery systems for WMD. And subsequently, the Arms Control and Regional Security Working Group that was formed from the multilateral discussions on Middle East peace in Madrid in 1991 also discussed options for arms control, including elimination of WMD, or sought to discuss before that process was derailed. It never came to fruition. In terms of some existing international instruments, I'm sure many of the people in the room already know these quite well. There is the MTCR in 1987, which is a voluntary export control regime comprising 35 members who agreed to restrict exports of missiles and related technologies capable of carrying a 500 kilogram payload, at least 300 kilometers, delivering any type of WMD. This excluded manned systems of WMD delivery, such as attack aircraft, and also as a control regime, it's legally not binding. Second, there's the Hague Code of Conduct, HCOC, in 2002, whereby subscribing states commit themselves to provide pre-launch notifications on ballistic missile and space launch vehicles and test flights. They also commit themselves to submit an annual declaration of their country's policies on ballistic missiles and space launch vehicles. This applies, obviously, as I said, to ballistic missiles and space launch vehicles only. It's not legally binding as a code of conduct, and it's considered largely a confidence-building measure. I would be remiss if I didn't note that Ambassador Laggner, who is joining us today in today's session, also served as HCOC chair, I believe quite recently, a year or two ago. And I'd be interested to hear what he says about it following my presentation. So some key dilemmas. We have this rapidly changing arms situation in the region that is making conventional means of delivery more of a daily reality, so to speak. This changing situation, which people could and have referred to as a revolution in military affairs, has at times made WMDs seem like an almost outdated risk or a secondary risk compared to newer systems. While this may further complicate addressing means of delivery, it could also lead to maybe a tipping point or a watershed moment, so to speak, when there's a push to address means of delivery more concertedly, given the growing concerns with conventional systems. And this will have positive spillover consequences on the zone. Two, many conventional weapons could have conventional and WMD application. So this line has been described as being continuously blurring by some experts. So an outright ban on all means of delivery is obviously not realistic. The distinction is quite increasingly difficult to do. And even in my paper, I grappled with trying to make that distinction clearly throughout the paper. Three, there are definitional arguments for restrictions and limitations. What activities would be considered acceptable and what activities would be considered weaponization is a question that comes to mind. Are we talking about production? Are we talking about assembly? Are we talking about acquisition or procurement of subsystems? What about research? So I think these issues would have to be sorted out as well. Fourth, even if we agreed in principle on controls, on means of delivery, states, meaning we, it's unclear what mechanism we would have to verify and implement such an agreement or who would enforce it either. Lastly, the sequence of elimination of WMD and means of delivery. On the one hand, means of delivery could become a moot point in the zone once WMD payloads are eliminated. On the other, eliminating means of delivery could gradually render WMD-related discussions easier. So it's somewhat a question of, what comes first, the chicken or the egg. In terms of the possible measures to address means of delivery that have been highlighted in the paper, there I would say, 4 or 5 categories. I won't go through them in great length, but I'll review them here with you. I think some of these measures on the declarations of include the first no first use of systems, declarations not to transfer them to non-state actors, or annual declarations of delivery system stockpiles. Some are more difficult to consider or implement than others. The no first use declarations might be more difficult because states could always claim that their use of delivery systems were retaliatory or in response to the action of other states. Declarations not to transfer them to non-state actors can be refuted, bypassed, or matter less, considering that the growing indigenous production of non-state actors and the annual declaration of stockpiles might be running counter to the tradition of ambiguity and opacity that some states adopt. On the second area, improving communication within or between countries can also serve to avoid miscalculation and escalation stemming from misinterpretation on the one hand, or unfounded threat perception on the other. And I think such measures could serve to diffuse tensions, but would also, interestingly, build capacity in the region to deal with future restrictions and limitations, as they could result in the formation of dedicated institutions, and in general, just be an exercise in verification processes in preparation for future agreed limits. In terms of qualitative and quantitative restrictions, some of these, like the limit of limiting ranges to within 2,000 kilometers, might have little bearing, like the self-imposed Iranian limitation, might have little bearing on the national security of regional states, because any confrontation would be intra-regional and would include targets within this range. But I think it would still have positive knock-on effects. It could serve to generally create positive dynamics by breaking taboos, easing tensions, but also then beginning helping build capacity of regional states to undergo such arms control processes. For limitations on the numbers of delivery systems, this could also inadvertently reduce the number of deployed systems, for example. But I would also say this is quite a complex undertaking for states to define. For operational restrictions such as detargeting, de-alerting, moratorium on missile testing, these might be considered ambitious, but they would have enormous direct impacts on deterrence systems and the military balance in the region, which is maybe why they're too ambitious, but maybe they would also require a certain level of trust to be existing in advance before considering them. Lastly, in terms of elimination of entire categories, the possibility of eliminating obsolete delivery systems or limiting payload sizes or payload types altogether. Obviously, on obsolete systems, they're unreliable to begin with during a military confrontation, or difficult to maintain as well. So that might be a pretty quick, easy win. The second would have more direct impacts on regional security, but also similar impacts on the broader picture of breaking taboos and building capacity. Just in terms of some closing thoughts, I think it would be important to distinguish between what's achievable and what's desirable when we look at WMD and non-WMD means of delivery. So the one added layer of complexity is that the measures I've spoken about seem to be focused on the context of nuclear and WMD arms control, but this doesn't address conventional systems that have dual use application, which, whether we like it or not, may have legitimate uses. So that's one important thing to keep in mind. Two, scientific and expert communities, I think, can, but also should be working in advance of political realities to lay the foundation for future arms control work and explore what is possible. There are numerous examples internationally of scientific communities working in advance of diplomatic and political communities to essentially do the same. Three, I think civil society can and again should continue to promote and refine such confidence building measures and also continue to explore others. I would also say, or really ask the group, is whether we're reaching a tipping point when it comes to means of delivery, when it comes to a means of delivery and the threat perception on means delivery. Do the growing risks of conventional systems increase the prospects that they'll be addressed internationally or by regional states, that there'll be a more concerted push to address them, either as part of the zone or separately? And then finally, notwithstanding the decision of the zone negotiators whether to address it within the treaty or separately, perhaps there are also other separate or parallel processes to support this. And here I'm very clear on saying support, not replace the zone, but maybe something to support it. With that, I think I've spoken enough, and I'll hand the floor back over to him. Thank you.
Thank you, Nasser. We are also, as you mentioned, are very fortunate today to have with us Ambassador Benno Laggner, who kindly agreed to offer commentary based on his extensive experience both on the Middle East Weapon of Mass Destruction Free Zone, as well as a former HCOC chair. Ambassador Laggner is the resident representative to the IAEA, permanent representative to the CTBTO PrepCom in the permanent mission of Switzerland, Vienna in Austria. He serves as the chair of the Nuclear Supplier Group, the head of the Task Force for Nuclear Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, and the head of the Division for Security Policy at the Directorate Political Affairs in Bern, and deputy head of the Swiss Delegation for Security Policy Issues to the OSCE in Vienna, with the title of minister, among many other important appointments. So thank you, Ambassador Laggner, for joining us today, and the mic is yours.
Well, thank you, Chen, first of all, for inviting me. I will really address the issue from the perspective of my previous experience as HCOC chair in 2020-2021. And I just wanted to add that I'm also currently chairing the Missile Technology Control Regime for 1 year. Let me begin really by commending UNIDIR for the important project on the Middle East WMD-Free Zone. I think it's very important to have this repository of knowledge, of institutional memory, about research, about the negotiations on the zone, and also to be able to stimulate the debate with fresh ideas. And I also really want to congratulate Nasser on an excellent paper, because it addresses in a very comprehensive manner an issue that is not talked about very often. Now, why is this the case? Well, the main focus for many are the weapons, especially the nuclear weapons. And we can see this, for instance, also if we look at the 2018 UN General Assembly decision that set up the conference on the establishment of a Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. It doesn't mention means of delivery. Then again, means of delivery are not covered by an international treaty, unlike weapons of mass destruction, where we of course have international treaties with review processes, regular conferences that provide an opportunity to discuss the issue. Then also Nasser mentioned there is no common view on how to deal with the issue within the zone. How should it be dealt with? When should it be dealt with as part of the zone? And then again, as we have heard, there are quite a number of countries in the region that have missiles, so maybe they're also not too keen to talk about this issue. Yet there are good reasons why this issue of delivery systems deserves more attention. First of all, they are an integral part of the zone. They are there in the terms of reference. The 1995 resolution that was adopted at the 1995 NPT Review and Extension Conference mentions WMD delivery systems explicitly in 2 of the operative paragraphs. Second, they are of relevance for the region. As Nasser already mentioned, 11 states in the region possess either ballistic or cruise missiles or both of them. And when I talk about the region, I'm really looking at the 24 states that are commonly used as the definition for the zone. So the 22 members of the League of Arab States plus Israel and Iran. Now, some of the countries that possess missiles that in terms of their payload and range would be capable of carrying WMDs. Missiles have also been used in conflicts in the region, as Nasser has pointed out. And proliferation of missiles in the region, including to non-state actors, is clearly a matter of concern. So the key question is really how to address the security challenges associated with missiles. And Nasser mentions a number of options in his paper, and I want to use my time to really highlight and elaborate on one of them, that is to use existing international instruments. I think that is the most promising avenue available at this time to address the issue of missiles in the region. As mentioned before, they are not discussed in the context of the conference. I think the 3rd session will be taking place shortly. There is also no other regional mechanism to discuss security-related issues such as missiles. Now, the most important existing instrument in this regard is the Hague Code of Conduct, and it therefore seems to me the most realistic entry point for a discussion. It is a low threshold instrument. That's also one of the reasons I think it is realistic to look at the code. Low threshold because it is politically binding and not legally binding. It does not require ratification. It is also low threshold because it does not prohibit or restrict ballistic missile possession or development, which would be unrealistic, I think, at the moment. Its focus is really on responsible missile-related behavior and on concrete transparency and confidence-building measures. Now, the states that subscribe to the Hague Code of Conduct commit themselves to implement some general measures, but also some specific transparency measures. Now, these specific transparency measures cover both ballistic missiles and space launch vehicles because of the similar technology used for both. And also because space launch programs could be used to conceal ballistic missile programs. So the concrete confidence-building measures that have been agreed in the framework of the code are to submit annual declarations on ballistic missile or space launch vehicle policies, as well as on the number of launches during the preceding year. Then a second confidence-building measure and transparency measure is to provide pre-launch notifications regarding ballistic missile and space launch vehicle launches and test flights. Pre-launch notifications is also, for example, something that is used in some bilateral agreements, for example, between India and Pakistan or Russia and China. China and Pakistan, for example, 2 countries that are not subscribing states to the code. So pre-launch notifications is quite a common thing that could be used. And finally, also a third confidence and transparency measure, subscribing states agree to consider on a voluntary basis inviting observers to their land launch sites for space launch vehicles. Now, to date, 143 states have subscribed to the code, with Somalia, a state from the zone region, being one of the last ones to do so. And even non-subscribers attach importance to the code as part of the global non-proliferation architecture. This can be seen in the broad level of support for the HCOC resolution, which is tabled in the UN General Assembly every 2 years, and this year will be the next time the resolution will be voted on. The last resolution in 2020 was adopted with 176 UN member states voting in favor, 10 abstaining and 1 against. So you can see 143 subscribing states, 176 voting in favor of the resolution. There is really broad support for this instrument. Out of the 24 states that form the defined geographical area of the zone, only 9 have subscribed to the code. So there is clearly a gap in the region that needs to be filled. And in particular, some of the countries with the most important ballistic missile holdings in the region are missing. Now, there are a number of reasons. Some have criticized the code as not having been negotiated within the UN framework. Some criticize that input that they provided during the negotiation process was not taken into account. Others criticize the limited scope because the HCOC just focuses on ballistic missiles capable of WMD delivery. It doesn't include, for instance, our cruise missiles. And others wrongly consider that the code could hinder them in developing space capabilities. And I say wrongly because the code explicitly recognizes that subscribing states will benefit from the peaceful uses of space. Now, during Switzerland's chairmanship of the code, we made an effort to reach out in particular also to states in the region. We sponsored a workshop by the Geneva Center for Security Policy for countries from the region, and we made démarches to a number of countries to increase support for the UN General Assembly resolution. In 2020, 15 out of the 23 UN member states from the region, Palestine is not a UN member state, 15 out of the 23 UN member states voted in favor of the resolution. So 9 have subscribed to the code and 15 voted in favor of the HCOC resolution, 4 more than in 2018. 5 abstained, and 1 state from the region, Iran, has been consistently voting against the code, against the resolution. Now, I don't want to hide the fact that the code has certain weaknesses. Its scope is limited to ballistic missiles capable of delivering WMD. It doesn't cover conventional missiles. It doesn't cover cruise missiles. But given that ballistic missiles are the most important means of delivery for WMD, it's at least a starting point. And I think, therefore, the code could be valuable as a starting point for a discussion on this issue within the context of the zone, because the zone is dealing with WMD. Moreover, the code also explicitly encourages subscribing states to adopt additional bilateral and regional transparency measures. It could therefore be complemented by region-wide agreed CBMs, such as some of them outlined in the paper by Nasser. And I think, for example, the idea of maybe a temporary moratorium on testing, or the idea of some operational restrictions, for example, not targeting civilian infrastructure, could be issues that could be looked at. But for example, you could also imagine maybe some measures concerning conventional missiles to be included in something additional to subscription to the Hague Code of Conduct. And finally, the code also provides a standing forum to discuss missiles. In the absence of any regional security forum, states of the region could use the annual HCOC meetings that take place in Vienna to exchange views on missile-related aspects of regional security. Now, of course, these transparency and confidence-building measures are only one of the instruments to address the issue of missiles, of WMD-capable missiles. If we want to look at the issue more comprehensively, we also need to take into consideration the supply side. And that's where the MTCR as an export control regime comes into play. That's where UN Security Council Resolution 1540 that obliges all states to establish domestic controls comes into play, and where the MTCR guidelines and control lists can be used by states that are also not members of the MTCR in order to fulfill their 1540 obligations. So really, to sum up, I think the Code of Conduct, the Hague Code of Conduct, could be a starting point. It's a realistic starting point. It is an instrument that is already signed up to by a number of states in the region. It is an instrument that enjoys broad support from the international community. It's modest, but this modesty is maybe also the reason why it would be a realistic starting point. And it offers the possibility to be built upon, for example, also by some other concrete additional measures, be it in terms of some of the measures outlined by Nasser, or also by including conventional missiles in the conversation. So I think I'll leave it there, and apologies for the bad connection. I hope you were able to hear most of what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Laggner. And I think I at least have 4 different questions for Nasser as well as for Ambassador Laggner. But let me refer to one of them before I will take my prerogative as the facilitator, and then later on as we turn to the question by our participants and I start seeing some questions, please, if you are interested to ask a question, please post it in the Q&A. Nasser and also Ambassador Laggner referred to that. You gave a very useful overview of where the issue of means of delivery was addressed in several historical regional processes. And then Ambassador Laggner's mentioned how it is being addressed in the conference today, or that it was not mentioned in the 2018 resolution. Can you please tell us some words of where the issue stands now in the ongoing zone negotiation in the UN?
This question is for me, Chen. I think we're actually at a stalemate, or at some situation of gridlock. If I do say so myself, I would characterize it as this. There, as Ambassador Laggner mentioned, so few opportunities for states to meet and discuss threat concerns or threat perception or risk reduction. And it's unfortunate that there is this stalemate, because it's the only current avenue, say, to discuss it. If we think about other opportunities outside the zone or parallel to the zone, I think the lesson that we've learned from other arms control situations is that you can start with very unambitious conversations on risk reduction through existing configurations like HCOC or emerging even bilateral configurations like the current Baghdad conference that's being held between Saudi Arabia and Iran, that could serve as an entry point for, I don't want to say alternatives to the zone, but discussions that could maybe provide an entryway for progress of the zone. We could also consider groups of like-minded countries, like having what's been referred to as minilateral processes, and build outwardly from there.
Thank you. And you also addressed one of the questions that I had in mind later on, which is really how given the deadlock, how we can actually overcome it with either within the process of the zone or outside. So thank you for prompting me on that. Another question that I have is that you mentioned in your remark developments that influence proliferation of means of delivery in the region. Can you elaborate a little bit on these regional trends and the technical developments and how these really, you think, influence the efforts to limit means of delivery?
So I think the means of delivery race, if you want to call it a race, is maybe both a symptom and a product of regional insecurity. And the trends for proliferating means of delivery is directly tied to that. More importantly, what you say regarding the technical developments, I think this is the main challenge. The emerging technologies have shaken up really the arms control community working on the zone, who have been accused of being traditionalists, adopting a very traditional approach on traditional systems. One expert told me as I was writing my paper that we're not in the 90s anymore, Nasser. There's a new game in town, and I guess that that new game is unmanned drones, unmanned systems. So the scope, the speed of its evolution is remarkable, and also the defenses against it are really not catching up. And some say there may be a time we may have reached it already, or we may be approaching it, rapidly approaching it, when these systems become an equal or greater concern or threat than because of the growing range, the payload capabilities, and the lethalities, the other capabilities of these systems. And if we were to consider other disruptive technology, like the potential adoption of or incorporation of artificial intelligence into these systems, which could increase their indiscriminate nature, lethality and indiscrimination being characteristics of WMDs. How does this impact the means of delivery is yet to be seen. It certainly makes it a more complex issue to grapple.
Thank you. Ambassador Laggner, you mentioned that one way that for countries to address this is to adopt either individually or as a group the HCOC. Can you elaborate a little bit? How do you see what are the options for regional countries if they are considering to have it as part of the zone as provisions, or what would be the arrangements? How do you see it happen, if at all?
Well, of course, HCOC, as it deals with WMD-capable ballistic missiles, there is a clear link to the zone. And it could be one of the confidence-building steps during the establishment of the zone. Now, one of the problems, as I mentioned, is only 9 out of the 24 participants in the zone discussions, or those who should be participating in the discussions, have actually subscribed to the code, but 15 voted in favor in the UN General Assembly resolution. So I think now the effort should be really focusing on the 6 that have voted in favor of the resolution, but have not yet taken the step to subscribe, and to see how could we maybe try to get these countries on board, to try and create some momentum. There are also countries, and I mentioned Iran, for example, as Iran has been consistently voting against the resolution. I think there might need to be a separate conversation to find out why. What are the reasons? Egypt is one of the countries that abstains on the resolution. For some of these countries, the fact that HCOC has not been adopted in a UN process is one of the weaknesses they see. It was actually born out of the MTCR and then transformed into a larger negotiating process. So some see this as a kind of a more exclusive instrument. But I mean, we've now had 9 resolutions in the General Assembly. We'll have a 10th this year with clear support. I mean, nobody can say anymore that HCOC has not been espoused by the UN. So I think we also need to move on maybe from where the original weaknesses were and look at where we are today. But I think it would be useful maybe to try and focus on the countries that have, by voting yes, shown a positive disposition to the code, and see if one or other of these countries could be convinced to subscribe. Now, of course, you may ask, what are the benefits? What are the benefits? Why would you want to subscribe to the code? Well, the benefits are, first of all, you get to also have access to the information provided by the other subscribers. The annual declarations, the pre-launch notifications, they are uploaded on a restricted website, which is only available to the HCOC subscribing states. So you actually get access to information that the others upload, which is part of this confidence building exercise. Second, of course, it is an important also message you are sending in terms of supporting the non-proliferation architecture. So, and then some countries complain, well, these declarations, they might take a lot of time to prepare them. No, I mean, for countries, for example, that do not have any ballistic missile programs, there is a simplified form they can fill in. So I think a lot of the reasons that are being advanced why countries are hesitant to subscribe to the code, some of the misperceptions can be easily dispelled, but that requires maybe more intensive dialogue with the countries concerned. And then I think the other big advantage, which I mentioned at the end, is missiles is really an issue not only unexplored within the context of the zone, but also in global terms. We do not have an international treaty regulating missiles. And the HCOC provides a forum where at least once a year, countries get together in Vienna at the annual meeting, and where you can address all different aspects related to missiles. So it's a starting point, and maybe we should try and work from that step by step.
Thank you. And I think the two important aspects that you mentioned is one is the CBM aspects of it, that really, given the situation in the region of the deep mistrust, that can help with alleviate some aspects related to missiles and mistrust, or missile delivery and mistrust. And then the flexibility of the tool, as you describe it, and that can be tailored to the region, either as a CBMs standalone by specific countries, or as a tool overall if countries in the region decide to adopt it together. So thank you for that. With that, I will turn to some questions from our audience, and if others have questions, please put them in the Q&A. So Hassan Awad, I have you as the next person to ask. If you can please introduce yourself as well as ask your question.
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Nasser and Ambassador, for the very informative and beautiful presentation and comments. My name is Hassan Awad. I am an independent researcher on disarmament, and mainly I'm focusing on how to apply the kind of a GCPO on the Middle East. And in my research, I found that the role of the civil society is equal to zero. And I understand how complicated it is for the United Nations to infiltrate, to integrate the civil society, because it's doesn't want to be accused of intervening in the policies, in the politics. But we know the power of the civil rights groups, of the local communities, on putting pressure on their governments. And because they are mainly the main target of it. They are the main people who will be affected by the environmental impacts, by health, by all of that. And it is related to the subject that we are discussing. So what do you have to do? What strategies do you have to apply and to engage the civil society on such a project or a process? And another question is, there is now the Abraham Accords, which brings everybody to the table, mostly everybody, because most of the states in the region have the under-table security alliances and economic cooperation. So how do you think would a peace process that includes all the states in the region? I know that Iran and non-state factors are, against, but hopefully they will get engaged after some of the agreements, including the lately agreement between Israel and Lebanon. How do you think this will affect the process of disarmament, and what role should the United Nations have, more than just doing reports on that and talking to the politicians? I mean, the civil society and local communities. Thank you.
And here, Hassan. Nasser, if you can take the two questions, and Ambassador Laggner, I will give you also to answer if in case there is any involvement of either the MTCR or the HCOC with civil society. We'll be interested to hear that if there is any aspects of that. But before that, Nasser.
Yeah, thank you for that question and intervention, Hassan. And, it's really a spot-on question. I won't be answering in my capacity as a UN representative because I don't represent the UN in my response. I'm not familiar with the UN position on this. But I would tell you that from my experience, the role of civil society is critical. A lot can be done in civil society away from public pressure, but also in a more innovative setting, in a political setting. But it's not only relegated to the international level. It's the role of civil society within and between states. One of the major issues that I find is a problem in our region is that the capacities don't always exist in our region to pursue disarmament opportunities. So let us imagine that tomorrow we wake up and we find ourselves in a new Middle East where everybody loves each other and everybody wants to disarm. I think the capacities, the required capacities to do that and to verify that do not exist. So I think civil society has an important role in building capacities that can support states as they approach or consider disarmament issues. And that doesn't mean that you have to invest in a cadre of arms control specialists, but it can mean that existing capacities can also be tailored to disarmament and verification issues, like remote sensing technologies are very common for land use mapping, for environmental applications, but they're also very relevant for arms control and monitoring of programs and such. So I would say it's not only what the UN can do for civil society, it's what civil society can do for their own countries. And we all know there are a number of problems as well in the relationship between states and their civil societies. But that's another issue altogether. Regarding the Abraham Accords, again, not speaking on behalf of the UN, speaking in my personal capacity, it can serve to reduce tensions or it can serve to heighten tensions. I don't know. You say what impact this will have on regional peace. I think regional peace is contingent on issues that are more related to the Palestinian question rather than to this engagement between Israel and the GCC. It's not a criticism of it, but that's my opinion. Thank you.
Ambassador Laggner.
Well, Chen, you asked about civil society and HCOC and MTCR. Well, first of all, HCOC does not have a civil society component. The meetings that take place are closed meetings. We also do not have any observers, so it's only for the countries that have subscribed to the code, which, speaking in my really personal capacity, I think we might need to think about also opening up somehow to some observers. It could be a step to get states interested to subscribe. But no, there is no civil society engagement with the code as such. We have, of course, some civil society actors that play an active role in helping to promote the code. And here I'd like to mention specifically the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique in Paris, which has a mandate also from the European Union to organize webinars and really supports the HCOC chair very much in outreach activities by organizing specific region-specific seminars. I had a range of them when I was chair of HCOC. So playing a supportive role, but there is no civil society involvement in the meetings or the work of the HCOC. And the MTCR is an export control regime. Like all export control regimes, confidentiality is one of the key elements. What we do, we have some transparency measures in the sense that we have a public website. We publish certain things on the website. We inform about our meetings. I mean, we participate invited to conferences, which provide talk or what the, but of course, site involved.
Thank you, Ambassador Laggner. And Hassan, I know that probably it's a non-satisfactory answer in the sense, but I think in the UN, in the different disarmament mechanism, you see inconsistency about how you involve and how they involve civil society. Some conferences and mechanism and treaties are very welcoming it, and others are not. It's actually not necessarily a UN decision. It's the member state decision how they're doing it and how they involve civil society. So I think it's really mechanism dependent and forum dependent. I would say generally people that have power or decision making usually might not think about the benefits of involving the civil society, but that's, I think, a mistake. And I think part of ours as UNIDIR is to bring those voices of experts, of young people, of scientists that might not necessarily be in the conversation, but can inform it, given the fact that all of us in the region are being impacted by the decisions that are being made. So we just need to create those mechanisms and those forums where the voices can be heard, even if it's not on official basis.
If I may add something, targeting the youth will be very welcomed in the region because there's a lot of mistrust between the communities and their governments. I worked for 6 years for President Mahmoud Abbas, and I worked on projects on youth, raising awareness, and etc. So I understand where we come from, and I know what mechanisms should work in the region, especially in this time of the economic distress in the region. So my point is, how can we all together as a civil society, as practitioners and experts, as the United Nations and international organizations, to make more focus on funding on projects to engage youth and women and the new generation in the process of not pushing their governments, because governments don't accept that usually, because I know that the focus is on the elite and what they prefer. How can we engage the youth and women by doing more funding towards engaging them in the process, to be part of the process, to feel the ownership of the process? My thinking, my experience tells me that it's possible, but we need to put more effort towards channeling the funding, because usually funding goes to building streets, building schools, but what is the outcome? We don't have an actual outcome that changes the civil society and the human behavior towards a certain issue, and including disarmament.
Thank you, Hassan, and we definitely are considering all those aspects and have been involved in our project, at least, and in young people, scientists, as well as others. And then I think if there is no other additional questions in the with our audience, and I do not see it, since our time is almost up, I will conclude, but I just want to make sure that our audience understand this is something that are still on one end under negotiation within the member countries from the region, within the NPT within the UN context, as well as obviously topic that has been discussed in the NPT review conferences and other places. So countries in the region are very interested, very trying to figure out where to fit this topic within the negotiations. And we also are looking on different aspects of how to engage as many people as possible and many voices as possible. So with that, let me please conclude our event. I will thank in particular to several people that supported this event and the publication. Anlor, Sarah Ruth, and Letitia. As well, I want to thank all of you, Nasser, Benno, and all our participants for these important questions that we discussed today. And I hope that all of you have a very good rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.